Well, hello, my name is Colin Douch, and I'm here to tell you that you already have an SLO. And you might be wondering, who is this guy, right? As I say, my name is Colin Douch. I've been working in what we call observability for many years now. I'm currently doing that at Cloudflare. But I actually got my start in physical mechanical systems before realizing that physics kind of sucks, and the less I have to deal with that, the better. But I'm now working on bare metal, so boy, did I make a mistake. But it's interesting because both of those industries, the sort of physical world and the computerized world, we have to deal with abstractions when dealing with customers. I come from a physical world. Mine operators don't really care that a carrier bearing in the middle of their sifter has failed. They just know they're losing money because of the downtime, right? And in that way, SLOs become this convenient abstraction to explain to your customers what they can expect out of your system, to communicate the intended reliability of your product. And I mentor a few grads out of New Zealand, where I'm from originally, and it's funny because I was sitting down with one of them a couple of months back, and we were having a coffee, and she started talking about SLOs, right? She's reading about them and how they benefit you, and she wanted to know, how can you get started? She's in a sort of early stage startup and thought it would be a good idea. And that sort of inspired this talk, because even if you haven't explicitly set an SLO, well, you still have one, because your customers have an expectation of your service. And whether or not you want it, if you haven't set expectations differently, then that's your SLO. And so you're probably thinking, well, job done, right? We have SLOs, so we can tell our managers who've hopefully been inspired by this conference, well, Colin said we already have SLOs, so there. And then we can take the rest of the week off, and we can celebrate with a nice beverage or two, and we can go back to the mainframe and pre-networking days and forget that this whole nightmare of distributed systems ever happened. But of course, it's not that easy, right? The bad news is that that expectation, that sort of implied SLO, is generally based on the past uptime of your service. And if it's down a few hours a week, well, your customers have come to accept that. But if it's never down, then bad news, because any error, any slowdown, and that's a breach of that implied SLO, your customers have started relying on that past uptime. And if you haven't set expectations differently, then because you're going to get complaints about that single request that took slightly longer than usual. And so let me tell you a story to sort of illustrate this point. And unfortunately, we don't have a campfire, so you'll have to imagine the spooky atmosphere yourself. But at Cloudflare, we had an internal logging system. We called it rather unimaginatively LogX. And one day it had an outage. Not huge, but it was dropping maybe 0.1% of logs in a kind of subtle way that eluded our monitoring at the time. And at the time, we'd sort of shied away from SLOs. They were always something that in the back of our minds, we knew we should be setting explicitly. And at the time, we were sort of focused on other more pressing things, but we didn't immediately notice this issue because it had sort of eluded our monitoring. And so we didn't notice it, but our users did. And almost immediately, we started getting messages from some of our internal teams saying, what was going on? Right? Have we changed anything? And which were a bit complex, because not only had we not changed anything, whoever has, right? But it was only 0.1% of errors. Why were people so up in arms about what we considered to be a minor outage? And it was at that point it was communicated to us that one of our internal teams had actually built a customer-facing product on top of it. And that's why people were so concerned. Sort of side, and we all hands on deck to the problem, and we eventually sorted it out as an issue that we'd sort of known was festering for a while. And by then, we had a few engineering teams in our hands that were rather annoyed. We thought your systems were reliable. We built this thing on top of it because we thought it was reliable. What was the reason for the outage? And where can I read an incident report? And we sort of had to sit down and wonder how we actually got here, because we got here by not explicitly setting expectations. We got here by not explicitly setting an SLO, because who are we to say that our service wasn't meant to be customer facing? Because we'd sort of always implied that it was meant to be internal, but never really defined what that meant. And in our minds, well, we sort of thought it meant that it could suffer some level of outage that wouldn't be tolerated by our external customers, but we never really communicated that well. We never set an explicit SLO, a definition of what those outages meant. And so if we haven't set it, if we haven't communicated, well, who are we to say it's not meant to be customer facing? And so our engineering teams looked at the perceived reliability of our system and decided, well, yeah, it's always up, and thus we can create this customer-facing product on top of it. And so in a way, we were sort of victims of our own success in that regard. Right? Our logging system was too reliable because we hadn't explicitly set this SLO. It never really went down. So our internal engineering teams naturally assumed it was completely reliable. Why not build stuff on top of it? And this is rather frustrating because there was sort of this disconnect between what we had intended to offer and what we were actually offering. And so once we'd spent some time and we'd built out a proper infrastructure for this internal team, we sort of sat down and tried to come up with some learnings. And this is what I really want to communicate. And that's that, first and foremost, SLOs are a language that you can use to communicate the intended reliability of your service. They're a way to abstract over all of the technical details about what can go wrong and get right to the heart of what your customers actually care about, which is how much can they expect out of it. And the other thing to note is that everyone has expectations. So even if you haven't set those expectations in the form of an SLO, well, that doesn't mean that your customers don't de facto have them. They're sort of what they perceive rather than what you're setting. And the final thing I want to end on is, even if you have explicitly set those SLOs, well, you still need to meet them. And you can't meet them too well because, our intended reliability was less than what our actual reliability was. And that was sort of our downfall, because even though we were beating what our implied SLO was, well, other teams had assumed that it was more reliable than what we had intended. And so even if you are explicitly setting SLOs, you need to not beat them too much, because there will be some team that hasn't read those SLOs that you have set and will assume that it is better than you're actually intending. And that's the sort of point I want to end on, is that you have this SLO, you have this implied SLO, whether you are explicitly setting those expectations or not, people will assume reliability even when none exists. Thank you.